Mr. President, I rise today because we are in the midst of a deeply troubling, in my judgment, trend regarding banking and the Second Amendment. And I know that seems a bit strange. What does banking have to do with the Second Amendment? I wondered that myself. Allow me to explain. We have 120 million gun owners in America. And like those Americans, I am alarmed by the activist, anti-gun policies unveiled by the "we are smarter than you" financial elites who run two Wall Street banks, Citigroup and the Bank of America. They have a political agenda. And those banks' political agenda stands to hurt many small businesses in my state of Louisiana who are going to lose their banking services simply because these small businesses choose to exercise their constitutionally protected Second Amendment right. On March 22nd of this year, Mr. President, Citigroup issued a press release. That press release detailed how Citigroup will penalize banking clients who follow federal, state, and local gun laws. Citigroup's new policy will tell businesses what kind of firearms they can stock, what kind of accessories those small businesses can stock in their stores, and who they can sell them to. I thought this was America, Mr. President. Now, this new policy has already taken effect all across Citigroup, and it has impacted hundreds of small businesses, institutional clients, and even their credit card partners. Not to be outdone, 2 weeks later, Bank of America joined in. On April 10th, Bank of America announced that it will no longer loan money to businesses that, in its opinion, are deplorables because those businesses manufacture legal semi-automatic rifles. Targeting firearms owners and business owners is not only an affront to the responsible, law-abiding, constitutional gun owners across this country, it's a threat to the sanctity of our very Constitution and the Second Amendment. I realize that the management of these two banks have a Constitution whose Bill of Rights jumps from 1 to 3, but I can assure them that in the rest of the Constitutions read by the rest of America, there is a Second Amendment. I've written both the chief executive officers of Citigroup and Bank of America about my concerns, and they've yet to respond. I understand that Mr. Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, is actually here in Washington lobbying folks on Capitol Hill this week. I suppose he was too busy to come by and address my concerns. Once again, I invite him to come by my office and speak about this in person. Mr. President, I can't overstate the gravity of this issue. It's important for consumers and businesses all across America. Both Citigroup and Bank of America are considered by the United States government to be, quote, systematically important banks. That means they're too big to fail. That's why the American taxpayers had to bail them out in 2009. The American taxpayers, many of whom Citigroup and Bank of America now condescend to across our great land, gave Citigroup $476 billion of their hard-earned money. Not $476 million to bail out Citigroup, $476 billion. And the American taxpayer, many of whom choose to exercise their rights under the Second Amendment, and who these banks are trying to now punish, those taxpayers gave Bank of America $336 billion in 2008 and 2009 to keep them from going broke. Now, these banks are supposed to act as a source of credit for households and businesses and local and state governments, and as a source of liquidity for the entire banking system, Mr. President. But that also means that their corporate policies have ripple effects through every corner of our economy, from consumers and businesses of all sizes to banks and non-bank holding companies. Mr. President, if the banking system worked like a grocery store, I would still disagree with these new anti-gun rules by Citigroup and Bank of America, but I would respect their right to enact whatever corporate policies align with their beliefs. But banks are not grocery stores. A grocery store doesn't need a government charter to operate. A grocery store doesn't have a government corporation backed by the taxpayers of this country to ensure their deposits. A grocery store doesn't have a government bank that pays them interest. Banks do. One grocery store doesn't get so big that it lends and borrows and buys and sells from nearly every other grocery store in the country. Citigroup does, and so does Bank of America. A grocery store doesn't need an $812.3 billion bailout from the American taxpayers, many of whom choose to exercise their rights under the United States Constitution, including but not limited to the Second Amendment. Citigroup and Bank of America have decided to make banking a red versus blue issue by trampling on the Second Amendment rights of small business owners, and therefore all Americans. And if additional big consumer banks come out with similar anti-Second Amendment policies, it will get harder and harder for businesses in my state, Louisiana, and small businesses in other states and elsewhere to find banking services. We'll have red banks and we'll have blue banks. I don't think that's what we want in America, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to make sure that the federal government isn't rewarding this behavior with even more taxpayer dollars. I think $1 trillion to bail these two banks out by the American taxpayer is quite enough. I've already petitioned the General Services Administration to cancel the federal government's $700 billion contract with Citigroup. And I've urged officials in the state of Louisiana to reevaluate all state contracts with any Wall Street bank that chooses to implement an extra-legal policy that infringes on the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Citigroup and Bank of America owe their continued existence to the generosity of the American taxpayer. If it wasn't for the American taxpayer, there would be no Citigroup. There wouldn't be no Bank of America. I find it very disturbing that these Wall Street banks may be profiting from taxpayer-funded contracts. At the same time, they're pushing a political agenda, and that is what it is, a political agenda, and severing ties with law-abiding businesses in the process. Given the size of these banks, it's likely that the same is true in states across America. I find it offensive. I find it offensive that Wall Street banks are taking taxpayer dollars with one hand and condescending to them with their "we know better than you do" attitude by using the other hand to come after the guns that those taxpayers lawfully own under the Second Amendment. Rather than impose its political agenda on law-abiding citizens, these Wall Street banks ought to remember how taxpayers spent billions of dollars, almost $1 trillion, to bail them out after the 2008 financial crisis. They owe a tremendous debt to the American people, and it seems that they have a very short memory. Mr. President, we don't need red banks in America. We don't need blue banks in America. We need safe banks in America.